The Glass Castle, pages 19 to 29. We had to get far away from Las Vegas, Dad said, because the mafia, which owned the casinos, was after him. We headed west through desert and then mountains. Mom said we should all live near the Pacific Ocean at least once in our lives, so we kept going all the way to San Francisco. Mom didn't want us staying in one of those tourist trap hotels near Fisherman's Wharf, which she said were inauthentic and cut off from the real life of the city, so we found one that had a lot more character in a place called the Tenderloin District. Sailors and women with lots of makeup stayed there too. Dad called it a flop house, but Mom said it was an SRO. When I asked what that stood for, she told me the hotel was for special residents only. While Mom and Dad went out looking for investment money for the prospector, we kids played in the hotel. One day I found a half-full box of matches. I was thrilled because I much preferred the wooden matches that came in boxes over the flimsy ones in the cardboard books. I took them upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. I pulled off some toilet paper, lit it. When it started burning, I threw it down the toilet. I was torturing the fire, giving it life and snuffing it out. Then I got a better idea. I made a pile of toilet paper in the toilet, lit it, and when it started burning, the flame shooting up silently up out of the bowl, I flushed it down the toilet. One night, a few days later, I suddenly woke up. The air was hot and stifling. I smelled smoke, and then I saw flames leaping at the open window. At first, I couldn't tell if the fire was inside or outside, but then I saw that one of the curtains, only a few feet from the bed, was ablaze. Mom and Dad were not in the room, and Lori and Brian were still asleep. I tried to scream to warn them, but nothing came out of my throat. I wanted to reach over and shake them awake, but I couldn't move. The fire was growing bigger, stronger, and angrier. Just then the door burst open. Someone was calling our names. It was Dad. Lori and Brian woke up and ran to him, coughing from the smoke. I still couldn't move. I watched the fire, expecting that at any moment my blanket would burst into flames. Dad wrapped the blanket around me and picked me up, then ran down the stairs, leading Lori and Brian with one arm and holding me in the other. Dad took us kids across the street to a bar, then went back to help fight the fire. A waitress with red fingernails and blue-black hair asked if we wanted a Coca-Cola, or heck, even a beer, because we'd been through a lot that night. Brian and Lori said yes, please, to Cokes. I asked if I might please have a Shirley Temple, which was what Dad bought me whenever he took me to a bar. For some reason, the waitress laughed. The people at the bar kept making jokes about women running naked out of the burning hotel. All I had on was my underwear, so I kept the blanket wrapped tightly around me. After I drank my Shirley Temple, I tried to go back across the street to watch the fire, but the waitress kept me at the bar. So I climbed up on a stool to watch through the window. The fire trucks had arrived. There were flashing lights and men in rubber coats holding canvas hoses with big jets of water coming out of them. I wondered if the fire had been out to get me. I wondered if all fire was related, like Dad said all humans were related. If the fire that had burned me that day while I cooked hot dogs was somehow connected to the fire I'd flushed down the toilet and the fire burning at the hotel. I didn't have the answers to those questions, but what I did know was that I lived in a world that at any moment could erupt into fire. It's the sort of knowledge that kept you on your toes. After the hotel burned down, we lived for a few days on the beach. When we put down the back seat of the green caboose, there was room for everyone to sleep, though sometimes someone's feet would be sticking in my face. One night a policeman tapped on our window and said we had to leave. It was illegal to sleep on the beach. He was nice and kept calling us folks, and even drew us a map to a place where we could sleep without getting arrested. But after he left, Dad called him the goddamn Gestapo and said that people like that got their jollies pushing people like us around. Dad was fed up with civilization. He and Mom decided we should move back to the desert and resume our hunt for gold without our starter money. These cities will kill you, he said. After we pulled up stakes in San Francisco, we headed for the Mojave Desert. Near the Eagle Mountains, Mom made Dad stop the car. She'd seen a tree on the side of the road that had caught her fancy. It wasn't just any tree. It was an ancient Joshua tree. It stood in a crease of land where the desert ended and the mountain began, forming a wind tunnel. From the time the Joshua tree was a tiny sapling, it had been so beaten down by the whipping wind that rather than trying to grow skyward, it had grown in the direction that the wind pushed it. It existed now in a permanent state of windblownness, leaning over so far it seemed ready to topple, although in fact its roots held it firmly in place. I thought the Joshua Tree was ugly. It looked scraggly and freakish, permanently stuck in its twisted, tortured position, and it made me think of how some adults tell you not to make weird faces because your features could freeze. Mom, however, thought it was one of the most beautiful trees she'd ever seen. She told us she had to paint it. While she was setting out her easel, Dad drove up the road to see what was ahead. He found a scattering of parched little houses, trailers settling into the sand, and shacks with rusty tin roofs. It was called Midland. One of the little houses had a for rent sign. What the hell? Dad said. This place is as good as any other. The house we rented had been built by a mining company. It was white with 2 rooms and a sway-backed roof. There were no trees, and the desert sand ran right up to the back door. At night, you could hear the coyotes howling. When we first got to Midland, those coyotes kept me awake, and as I lay in bed, I'd hear other sounds. Gila monsters rustling in the underbrush, moths knocking against the screens, and the creosote crackling in the wind. One night when the lights were out and I could see a sliver of moon through the window, I heard a slithering noise on the floor. I think there's something under a bed, I said to Lori. It's merely a figment of your overly active imagination, Lori said. She talked like a grown-up when she was annoyed. I tried to be brave, but I heard something. In the moonlight, I thought I saw it move. Something's there, I whispered. Go to sleep, Lori said. Holding my pillow over my head for protection, I ran into the living room where Dad was reading. What's up, mountain goat? He asked. He called me that because I never fell down when we were climbing mountains. Sure-footed as a mountain goat, he'd always say. Nothing, probably, I said. I just think maybe I saw something in the bedroom. Dad raised his eyebrows. But it was probably just a figment of my overly active imagination. Did you get a good look at it? He asked. Not really. Well, you must have seen it. Was it a big old hairy son of a bitch with the Danvers-looking teeth and claws? That's it. And did it have pointed ears and evil eyes with fire in them? And did it stare at you all wicked-like, he asked. Yes, you've seen it too? Better believe I have. It's that old ornery bastard Demon. Dad said he'd been chasing Demon for years. By now, Dad said that old Demon had figured out it was better not mess with Rex Walls. But if that sneaky son of a gun thought I was going to terrorize Rex Wall's little girl, it had by God got another thing coming. Go fetch my hunting knife, Dad said. I got Dad his knife with the carved bone handle and the blade of the blue German steel, and he gave me a pipe wrench. And we all went looking for Demon. We looked under my bed where I'd seen it, but it was gone. We looked all around the house, under the table, in the dark corners of the closets, in the toolbox, even outside in the trash cans. Come here, you sorry-ass old demon, Dad called out in the desert night. Come out here and show your butt-ugly face, you yellow-bellied monster. Yeah, come on, you old mean demon, I said, waving the pipe wrench in the air. We're not scared of you. There was only the sound of the coyotes in the distance. This is just like that chicken shit demon, Dad said. He sat down on the front step and lit up a cigarette, then told me a story about the time Demon was terrorizing an entire town, and Dad fought it off in hand-to-hand combat, biting its ears and sticking its fingers in its eyes. Old Demon was terrified because that was the first time he'd met anyone who wasn't afraid of it. Damned old Demon didn't know what to think, Dad said, shaking his head with a chuckle. That was a thing to remember about all the monsters, Dad said. They love to frighten people, but the minute you stare them down, they turn tail and run. All you have to do, Mountain Goat, is show old Demon you're not afraid. Not much grew around Midland other than the Joshua tree, cacti, and the scrubby little creosote bushes that Dad said were some of the oldest plants on the planet. The great-granddaddy creosote bushes were thousands of years old. When it rained, they let off a disgusting, musty smell so animals wouldn't eat them. Only 4 inches of rain fell a year around Midland, about the same as in the northern Sahara, and water for humans came in on the train once a day in special containers. The only animals that could survive around Midland were lipless, scaly creatures such as Gila monsters and scorpions and people like us. A month after we moved to Midland, Juju got bitten by a rattlesnake and died. We buried him near the Joshua tree. It was practically the only time I ever saw Brian cry. But we had plenty of cats to keep us company. Too many, in fact. We had rescued lots of cats since we tossed Quixote out the window, and most of them had gone and had kittens, and it got to the point where we had to get rid of some of them. We didn't have many neighbors to give them to, so Dad put them in a burlap sack and drove to a pond made by the mining company to cool equipment. I watched him load the back of the car with bobbing, mewing bags. It doesn't seem right, I told Mom. We rescued them. Now we're going to kill them? We gave them a little extra time on the planet, Mom said. They should be grateful for that. Dad finally got a job at the gypsum mine, digging out the white rocks that were ground into the powder and used in drywall and plaster of Paris. When he came home, he'd be covered with white gypsum powder, and sometimes we'd play ghost and he'd chase us. He also brought back sacks of gypsum, and Mom mixed it with water to make Venus de Milo sculptures from a rubber cast she ordered through the mail. It grieved Mom that the mine was destroying so much white rock. She said it was real marble and deserved a better fate, and that by making her sculpture, she was at least immortalizing some of it. Mom was pregnant. Everyone hoped it would be a boy, so Brian would have someone to play with other than me. When it got time for Mom to give birth, Dad's plan was for us to move to Blythe, 20 miles south, which was such a big town. It had 2 movie theaters and 2 state prisons. In the meantime, Mom devoted herself to her art. She spent all day working on oil paintings, watercolors, charcoal drawings, pen and ink sketches, clay and wire sculptures, silk screens, and wood blocks. She didn't have any particular style. Some of her paintings were what she called primitive, some were impressionistic and abstract, some were realistic. I don't want to be pigeonholed, she liked to say. Mom was also a writer and was always typing away on novels, short stories, plays, poetry, fables, and children's books, which she illustrated herself. Mom's writing was very creative. So was her spelling. She needed a proofreader, and when Lori was just 7 years old, she would go over Mom's manuscripts checking for errors. When we were in Midland, Mom painted dozens of variations and studies of the Joshua tree. We'd go with her and she'd give us art lessons. One time I saw a tiny Joshua tree sapling growing not too far from the old tree. I wanted to dig it up and replant it near our house. I told Mom that I would protect it from the wind and water it every day so it could grow nice and tall and straight. Mom frowned at me. You'd be destroying what makes it special. It's the Joshua tree's struggle that gives it its beauty. I never believed in Santa Claus. None of us kids did. Mom and Dad refused to let us. They couldn't afford expensive presents, and they didn't want us to think we weren't as good as other kids who on Christmas morning found all sorts of fancy toys under the tree that were supposedly left by Santa Claus. So they told us all about how other kids were deceived by their parents, how toys the grown-ups claimed were made by little elves wearing bell caps in their workshop at the North Pole actually had labels on them saying made in Japan. Try not to look down on those other children, Mom said. It's not their fault that they've been brainwashed into believing silly myths. We celebrated Christmas, but usually about a week after December 25th, when you could find perfectly good bows and wrapping paper that people had thrown away and Christmas trees discarded on the roadside that still had most of their needles and even some silver tinsel hanging on them. Mom and Dad would give us a bag of marbles or a doll or a slingshot that had been marked way down in an after-Christmas sale. Dad lost his job at the gypsum mine after getting in an argument with the foreman, and when Christmas came that year, we had no money at all. On Christmas Eve, Dad took each of us kids out into the desert night one by one. I had a blanket wrapped around me, and when it was my turn, I offered to share it with Dad, but he said no thanks. The cold never bothered him. I was 5 that year, and I sat next to Dad, and we looked up at the sky. Dad loved to talk about the stars. He explained to us how they rotated through the night sky as the Earth turned. He taught us to identify the constellations and how to navigate by the North Star. Those shining stars, he liked to point out, were one of the special treats for people like us who lived out in the wilderness. Rich city folks, he'd say, lived in fancy apartments, but their air was so polluted they couldn't even see the stars. We'd have to be out of our minds to want to trade places with any of them. Pick out your favorite star, Dad said that night. He told me I could have it for keeps. He said it was my Christmas present. You can't give me a star, I said. No one owns stars. That's right, Dad said. No one else owns them. You just have to claim it before anyone else does, like that doggo fellow Columbus claimed America for Queen Isabella. Claiming a star as your own has every bit as much logic to it. I thought about it and realized Dad was right. He was always figuring out things like that. I could have any star I wanted, Dad said, except Betelgeuse and Rigel, because Lori and Brian had already laid claim to them. I looked up to the stars and tried to figure out which one was the best one. You could see hundreds, maybe thousands or even millions, twinkling in the clear desert sky. The longer you looked and the more your eyes adjust to the dark, the more stars you'd see, layer after layer of them gradually becoming visible. There was one in particular in the west above the mountains, but low in the sky, that shone more brightly than all the rest. I want that one, I said. Dad grinned. That's Venus, he said. Venus was only a planet, he went on, and pretty dinky compared to real stars. She looked bigger and brighter because she was much closer than the stars. Poor old Venus didn't even make her own light, Dad said. She shone only from reflected light. He explained to me that planets glowed because reflected light was constant, and stars twinkled because their light pulsed. I like it anyway, I said. I had admired Venus even before that Christmas. You could see it in the early evening, glowing on the western horizon, and if you got up early, you could still see it in the morning, after all the stars had disappeared. What the hell, Dad said. It's Christmas. You can have a planet if you want. And he gave me Venus. That evening over Christmas dinner, we all discovered outer space. Dad explained light years and black holes and quasars and told us about the special qualities of Betelgeuse, Rigel, and Venus. Betelgeuse was a red star in the shoulder of the constellation Orion. It was one of the largest stars you could see in the sky, hundreds of times bigger than the sun. It had burned brightly for millions of years and would soon become a supernova and burn out. And you can enjoy the soundtrack of my neighbor dogs howling for a minute here. It happens 4 to 5 times a day. So it doesn't matter if I'm in the house or outside the house. Okay, I got upset that Lori had chosen a clunker of a star, but Dad explained that soon meant hundreds of thousands of years when you were talking about stars. Rigel was a blue star, smaller than Betelgeuse, Dad said, but even brighter. It was also in Orion. It was his left foot, which seemed appropriate because Brian was an extra fast runner. Venus didn't have any moons or satellites or even a magnetic field, but it did have an atmosphere sort of similar to Earth's, except it was super hot, about 500 degrees or more. So, Dad said, when the sun starts to burn out and Earth turns cold, everyone here might want to move to Venus to get warm, and they'll have to get permission from your descendants first. We laughed about all the kids who believed in the Santa myth and got nothing for Christmas but a bunch of cheap plastic toys. Years from now, when all the junk they got's broken and long forgotten, Dad said, you'll still have your stars. At twilight once, the sun had hidden behind the Palin Mountains. The bats came out and swirled through the sky above the shacks of Midland. The old lady who lived next door warned us away from bats. She called them flying rats and said one got caught in her hair once and went crazy clawing at her scalp. But I loved those little ugly bats, the way they darted past their wings in a furious blur. Dad explained how they had sonar detectors, kind of like the ones in the nuclear submarines. Brian and I would throw pebbles, hoping the bats would think they were bugs and eat them. And the weight of the pebbles would pull them down and we'd keep them as pets, tying a long string to their claw so they would still fly around. I wanted to train one to hang upside down for my finger, but those darn bats were too clever to fall for our trick. The bats were out swooping and screeching when we left Midland for Blythe. Earlier that day, Mom had told us that the baby had decided it was big enough to come out and join the family. Once we were on the road, Dad and Mom got in a big fight over how many months she'd been pregnant. Mom said she was 10 months pregnant. Dad, who had fixed someone's transmission earlier that day and used the money he made to buy a bottle of tequila, said she probably lost track somewhere. I always carry children longer than most women, Mom said. Lori was in my womb for 14 months. Bullshit, Dad said, unless Lori's part elephant. Don't you make fun of me or my children, Mom yelled. Some babies are premature. Mine were all post-mature. That's why they're so smart. Their brains had longer to develop. Dad said something about freaks of nature, and Mom called Dad a Mr. Know-it-all smarty pants who refused to believe that she was special. Dad said something about Jesus H. Christ on a goddamn crutch not taking that much time to gestate. Mom got upset at Dad's blasphemy, reached her foot over to the driver's side and stomped on the brake. It was the middle of the night and Mom bolted out of the car and ran into the darkness. You crazy bee, Dad hollered. Get your goddamn ass back in this car. You make me, Mr. Tough Guy, she screamed as she ran away. Dad jerked the steering wheel to one side and drove off the road into the desert after her. Lori, Brian, and I braced one another with our arms like we always did when Dad went on some wild chase that we knew would get bumpy. Dad stuck his head out the window as he drove, hollering at Mom, calling her, and I'm not going to read these because they are very graphic, and ordering her to get back into the car. Mom refused. She was ahead of us, bobbing in and out of the desert brush. Since she never used curse words, she was calling Dad names like blankety blank and worthless drunk so-and-so. Dad stopped the car, then jammed down the accelerator and popped the clutch. We shot forward and toward Mom, who screamed and jumped out of the way. Dad turned around and went for her again. It was a moonless night, so we couldn't see Mom except when she ran into the beam of headlights. She kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide like a hunted animal's. We kids cried and begged Dad to stop, but he ignored us. I was even more worried about the baby inside Mom's swollen belly than I was about her. The car bounced on holes and rocks, brush scratching against its sides and dust coming through the open windows. Finally, Dad cornered Mom against some rocks. I was afraid he might smush her with the car, but instead he got out and dragged her back, legs flailing, and threw her into the car. We banged back through the desert and onto the road. Everyone was quiet except Mom, who was sobbing that she really did carry Lori for 14 months. Mom and Dad made up the next day, and by late afternoon, Mom was cutting Dad's hair in the living room in the apartment we'd rented in Blythe. He'd taken off his shirt and was sitting backward on the chair with his head bowed and his hair combed forward. Mom was snipping away while Dad pointed out the parts that were still too long. When they were finished, Dad combed his hair back and announced that Mom had done a hell of a fine shearing job. Our apartment was in a one-story cinder block building on the outskirts of town. It had a big blue and white plastic sign in the shape of an oval and a boomerang that said the LBJ Apartments. I thought it stood for Lori, Brian, and Jeanette, but Mom said LBJ were the initials of the president, who she added was a crook and a warmonger. A few truck drivers and cowboys had rooms at the LBJ Apartments, but most of the other people who lived there were migrant workers and their families, and we heard them talking through the thin sheetrock walls. Mom said it was one of the bonuses of living at the LBJ Apartments because we'd be able to pick up a little Spanish without even studying. Blythe was in California, but the Arizona border was within spitting distance. People who lived there liked to say the town was 150 miles west of Phoenix, 250 miles east of Los Angeles, and smack dab in the middle of nowhere. But they always said it like they were bragging. Mom and Dad weren't exactly crazy about Blythe. Too civilized, they said, and downright unnatural, too, since no town the size of Blythe had any business existing out in the Mojave Desert. It was near the Colorado River, founded back in the 19th century by some guy who figured he could get rich turning the desert into farmland. He dug a bunch of irrigation ditches that drained water out of the Colorado River to grow lettuce and grapes and broccoli right there in the middle of all the cactus and sagebrush. Dad got disgusted every time we drove past one of those farm fields with their irrigation ditches wide as moats. It's a goddamn perversion of nature, he'd say. If you want to live in the farmland, haul your sorry hide off to Pennsylvania. If you want to live in the desert, eat prickly pears, not iceberg pansy-ass lettuce. That's right, Mom would say. Prickly pears have more vitamins anyway. Living in a big city like Blythe meant I had to wear shoes. It also meant I had to go to school. School wasn't so bad. I was in the first grade, and my teacher, Miss Cook, always chose me to read aloud when the principal came in the classroom. The other students didn't like me very much because I was so tall and pale and skinny and always raised my hand too fast and waved it frantically in the air whenever Miss Cook asked a question. A few days later, after I started school, 4 Mexican girls followed me home and jumped me in an alleyway near the LBJ Apartments. They beat me up pretty bad, pulling my hair and tearing my clothes and calling me a teacher's pet and a matchstick. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. Looks to me like you got in a fight, Dad said. He was sitting at the table taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. Just a little dust up, I said. That was the word Dad always used after he'd been in a fight. How many were there? 6, I lied. Is that split lip okay? He asked. This little old scratch? I asked. You should have seen what I did to them. That's my girl, Dad said and went back to the clock. But Brian kept looking over at me. The next day when I got to the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair that fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. Just back off now, and everyone can walk away with all their limbs still attached, Brian said. It was another one of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls stared at him before bursting into laughter. Then they surrounded him. Brian did fairly well fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared beneath a flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and I hit one of the girls on the head with it. From the jolt in my arm, I thought I'd cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me to the ground and kicked me in the face, and then they all ran off, the girl I had hit holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple blood spots, the spots of blood seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain link fence he had discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves, and we eventually settled down to feast, burying our faces in the huge wet heads of lettuce and eating until our stomachs ached. I guess we scared them off pretty good, I said to Brian. I guess, he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud he'd taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. Lettuce war, Brian shouted. He tossed a half-eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved as it made a pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane, and a fine white powder came sprinkling down on our heads. 2 months after we moved to Blythe, when Mom said she was 12 months pregnant, she at last gave birth. After she'd been in the hospital for 2 days, we all drove out to pick her up. Dad left us kids waiting in the car with the engine idling while he went in for Mom. They came running out with Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders. Mom was cradling a bundle in her arms and giggling sort of guiltily, like she'd stolen a candy bar from a dime store. I figured they'd checked out Rex Walls style. What is it? Lori asked as we sped away. Girl, Mom said. Mom handed me the baby. I was going to turn 6 in a few months, and Mom said I was mature enough to hold her the entire way home. The baby was pink and wrinkly, but absolutely beautiful, with big blue eyes, soft wisps of blonde hair, and the tiniest fingernails I'd ever seen. She moved in confused, jerky motions as if she couldn't understand why Mom's belly wasn't still around her. I promised her I'd always take care of her. The baby went without a name for weeks. Mom said she wanted to study it first, the way she would study the subject of a painting. We had a lot of arguments over what the name should be. I wanted to call her Rosita, after the prettiest girl in my class. But Mom said that name was too Mexican. I thought we weren't supposed to be prejudiced, I said. It's not being prejudiced, Mom said. It's a matter of accuracy in labeling. She told us that both our grandmothers were angry because neither Lori nor I had been named after them, so she decided to call the baby Lily Ruth Maureen. Lily was Mom's mother's name, and Irma Ruth was Dad's mother's name, but we call the baby Maureen, a name Mom liked because it was a diminutive of Mary. So she'd also be naming the baby after herself, but pretty much no one would know that. That Dad told us would make everybody happy except his mom, who hated the name Ruth and wanted the baby called Irma, and Mom's mom, who would hate sharing her namesake with Dad's mom.